Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. My name is Gary and I hope you're all having a fantastic day or evening wherever you are. In today's story, OP found out his wife cheated on him after OP was outside in their driveway and saw his wife kissing his friend while they were in the house alone. Now, 2 years later, karma happened and his wife is miserable. Let's get into today's story. My situation happened about 2 years ago and I can still remember it like yesterday. I believe that me and my ex could be a shining example of a great couple, but we were anything but that in the end. My story is a very serious one because of loyalty. I'd been noticing a real lack of loyalty in relationships for a while now. Even though I was super loyal to my wife, she still cheated on me. Me, 32, and my wife, 31, were married for 6 years and we were happy. As far as I could tell, we never had any real problems. Money wasn't even an issue, even though we weren't rich. We were able to pay bills and go anywhere and do what we wanted as long as we planned for it. She worked in an office at a child clinic and I worked in fabrication since I always worked with my hands. My wife was fun, outgoing, and always was my ride or die. She always made me stop and appreciate life more instead of working all the time. We would go and travel every year, especially since my idea of a vacation was to sit in the backyard with a drink in my hand. Thanks to her, we visited Vegas, Cancun, and visited her cousin in San Juan. This was good because I haven't lived there since I was 11 or 12 years old. It was great to have a wife who added something to my life, even though I definitely would have married her because of her looks. Her face looked just like Una Chaplin, but she had the body of the weather girl, Terry Inouye. We got along with each other's family, so we were all good as family, especially since she was the only child. Hanging out at clubs and stuff was fun, but we got to the point after a while where we enjoyed each other's company more. But apparently, I had the situation all messed up because my wife cheated on me and got suspicious during a little get-together we always have at our house. Even though there was COVID, me and my ex invited our friends to hang out with us on the weekend. We would play music, drink, and play card games on Saturdays. Since the clubs weren't open and there were no concerts, our close friends hung out at our place. It had become a regular thing, especially since we had all the alcohol. This night though, after playing spades, one of my friends challenged another friend of mine to play me in a game of Texas Hold'em. This friend, let's just call this guy Rome, was super anxious to play me. This guy was working at the same job as my other friend, and that's how we got to know each other. Rome was the type that was flashy and braggadocious, and we all would have to bring his mind out of the clouds sometimes. And the game of Texas Hold'em would do this because he never beat me one-on-one before. At the time, we recently learned how to play it thanks to his uncle. Even though we weren't that good, I always would beat him, and for some reason it aided him. He lost me 7 times straight, and the last time he was talking shit a little too personal. He'd talk about having a better car than me, a better house than me, but he would act bitter about my winning streak. At first, I didn't want to play, but thanks to the hecklers, Rome insisted that we play. Sure enough, when we played, I ended up beating him twice. Pissed off, he wanted to play again, but I said that my ex and her friends wanted to play dominoes and had said we should stop. My ex jumped in and agreed, but he wanted to play one more game. He offered to put up $100 to play again, and when I still said no, he upped it to $150. After this, my friends started heckling me, saying it was easy money. I don't gamble because I know my luck, but I decided to play for the money, even though we don't put up any real money. It turns out he actually beat me, and I ended up losing $150. He jumped out of his seat and got in the face of our friend who was heckling him to gloat. They got into a heated argument, and we had to break them up for a while. After a handshake, Rome told me he really didn't want my money and declined when I said I was still going to pay him. When my ex came in from the kitchen, Rome told her he won, and she seemed surprised and happy for him. After giving him a hug, she told us it was time for her and her friends to play dominoes. The rest of the night, we didn't have any more problems. The only thing we had to deal with was him still gloating. When everybody was leaving, I was talking to my best friend Rich in our driveway. Standing there with him, I was able to see through the window of our house and see Rome talking to my ex. At first, I didn't think that anything was wrong and thought he was still gloating, but then I saw him pull her by her waist to him and put his forehead to hers. After a second, she walked back into our living room and he followed her out. This bothered me so much that Rich asked me what was wrong, since his back was kind of turned to it, and he missed what I saw. I said nothing, and I told him to get home safe. After everybody left, my mind couldn't get off what I saw. While cleaning up, I tried to rationalize it by saying they're friends, too, and that she was just happy for him that he won. But knowing how Rome was with women, that excuse I had only lasted a day. The next day, what I saw ate at my mind. I've never been the jealous type of guy, but it did make me nervous, and I had to get doubt out of my mind. That night, after we went to bed, I stayed up until 2 in the morning when I knew she was asleep. Sliding out of the bed, I took her phone and took my phone, too. Taking our phones to the living room, I called my brother Juan. My ex had a lock on her phone, and I knew the only one who could get me in it was Juan. I called him about 7 times, and he finally picked up. Sounding really annoyed, he asked me what I wanted. I told him to do me a favor and call her phone for me. He asked me why, and I told him I would tell him later, and after hanging up, he found her number and called it. After answering it real quick, I went in her text, and it totally broke me. There were a bunch of texts about him screwing her for about a year, and it was even worse than that. This guy was sending her videos of him stroking his private parts, and she once sent him back a pic with her mouth open and her tongue out. There were at least 7 or 8 pictures of him exposing himself, and I had to scroll away. I was so mad that I almost threw her phone across the room. My world was officially turned upside down, and though I was really going through it, I knew what I had to do. After getting some screenshots, I sent them to my phone, and I put her phone back on the charger. I decided to sleep on the couch, because I definitely wasn't sleeping with her. I was already planning how I wanted to get the hell out of this betrayed spouse marriage. The next morning, when we were getting ready for work, my ex asked me why I didn't come back to bed. After I said I didn't want to, she thought I was just being a smartass and playfully slapped me upside the head. If it wasn't so early, my ex probably would have gotten sassy with me, but just went to make her coffee to start the day. I never really went to work. I started looking for a good lawyer all day. After finding one, it was expensive, but he told me the best way to get the job done. When I filed, I had to wait till she got served, and that was the hard part. Seeing her in the house, she would try to hold a conversation with me, but I failed miserably. All that I could give her was yes, no, and maybe. Talking to her was hard to do after reading those texts. Know that she went to his place after work, and if I'm hanging out with Juan, she'd invite him to our place. At first, she would tell him it was the last time, then she would openly invite him over and text him until he did. This was an every week thing. I feel like I was lucky I had caught her. At least now I know why she always turned me down in bed and had to promise me sex. I just couldn't wait till she got served at her job. I was ready to explode on her, and I was ready to explode on Rome too. As messed up in the head as I was ready to move on. On the day she got served, I decided to take that day off as well. My ex called me and screamed at me that she couldn't believe I just served her with divorce papers. Apparently, she got served during her lunch break like I had asked, and her friends at work saw this. They had to be the ones to tell her that they were divorce papers. I told her I was divorcing her, and I needed her to look at it before she came back home. My ex hung up, and I knew she was on her way back. I probably should have had a friend with me at the time, but I wasn't thinking perfectly about the situation. When she pulled up, I sent her the screenshots of her texts with Rome. The second she bust in, she was crying and screaming at me. She said she knew I was acting funny, and asked how I could all of a sudden divorce her. I said she must not have gotten my text and said, check your phone. She said she wanted me to tell her, but I said, just check your phone. She looked in her phone, and when she saw her own texts with Rome, she dropped the phone and put her face in her hands. She sat down on the couch, and it was my turn to start screaming at her. I called her a hoe in so many different ways, and asked her how she could do this with my friend. She had this look of disbelief in her eyes, and was just saying sorry without even looking at me. I got my keys and just left to go to Juan's house. After breaking all the news to Juan, I called my family and friends. I then told her mother, and she relayed the message to her father, who was in Florida, helping a friend with his business. After sending the screenshots to Rome and telling him I was going to kick his ass if I saw him, he texted back, "I'm sorry, bro." After this, I had a meet up with my friends and told all of them that if they wanted to still be friends with Rome, that's cool, but I let them know that's not how I operate, and I wouldn't still hang with him if it happened to them. They agreed with me, and said to call if I needed them. My ex called me and said that she wanted to talk. She asked me if there was any way for us to reconcile. I told her not only did she cheat on me, but I saw that she was talking shit about me. She told him I wouldn't find out because I was wrapped around her finger, and agreed with every bad thing that Rome was saying about me. She said that she was sorry, and that while we were all together at our house, he started flirting with her, and always complimented her body. After he was getting in cool with her friends, they would hang out with Rome, but she wouldn't tell me. So whenever she would go to a Drake or a Bad Bunny concert with her friends, Rome was with them. I asked her why she didn't say anything. She said because she didn't want it to look weird. After that, he started flirting with her through texts, and she started flirting back. Then one of the few days I was passed out drunk, they started kissing, and it led to them touching each other. She said one day he popped up at our house when I was out. After claiming he just wanted to talk, he had started touching her and charming her again, and then he screwed her. I told her I know that she doesn't love me, and that's why there won't be any kind of reconciliation. After cursing her out again, I said don't talk to me, talk to my lawyer, and hung up. I was glad we didn't have a family yet. The divorce was terrible though, mostly because of COVID. She ended up getting our house, but she wasn't going to be able to keep it without my income. She had decided to sell it, and moved in with her friend Dina. Rome was cut off from my other friends because he was definitely not trustworthy. I was happy about this because with both of them out of my life, I felt free, especially in my new home I was renting. For 2 years, I haven't heard from either of them. I ran into a friend of hers at a restaurant, and she seemed happy to see me when she was coming in. She spilled the tea about my ex, and said she moved out of Dina's apartment, and got her own place recently. She said she missed me because she's on Tinder, and it frustrates her. We both just laughed, and I told her to enjoy her dinner because me and my brother were leaving. I recently broke down and checked her profile on Facebook, but turned my head instantly, and promised myself not to look at her Facebook page again. My ex's friend made me want to post this to say to you guys to be careful. Loyalty is important in relationships, and to always know who's around you. My wife didn't love me, but she was just too selfish. Plus, she is a gorgeous woman, so she was placed on a pedestal by me, and honestly didn't deserve it. But knowing all this, she took advantage of my love for her. All this honestly got me back in my feelings, but I want to tell you guys you can definitely make it over this. This was a hard thing to go back through, but I hope you don't lose sight of your happiness. Right now, I need a glass of Hennessy. I appreciate this community, make money, and live long. OP, I'm glad you were able to overcome your situation. I can imagine how painful it was for you to find out your wife was cheating the way that you did. At the end of your story, you mentioned that you accidentally peeked on your wife's Facebook page to check on how she's doing. Remember that in order to fully get over what happened to you, you should completely abstain from keeping up with how your wife is doing. Truth of the matter is, your marriage is over because she was not who she claimed she was. As far as I'm concerned, she should be history to you, and the last thing on your mind. Continue to focus on yourself and heal from this situation. I believe you can do it, OP. I'm sure your wife has already realized how badly she has messed up, and she is trying to fill that void by using Tinder, but trust me, it will not work. Best of luck to you, OP, and I hope you're able to soon find peace from the pain your wife has caused you. Thanks for taking your time to listen to today's story. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already done so, and comment below on what your thoughts are on today's story. Take care. My wife and I, 42, were touring Bora Bora for her 38th birthday. I worked hard every day to make this happen for her because she meant the world to me. We were together for 7 years at this point. For our vacation, we were part of a group that had several different tourist attractions lined up. The cost of the ticket included the attractions, hotel stay, transportation, and even meals and drinks. It was extremely convenient not having to think about money or our budget at all. Looking back, it felt like I was in a different world for that week. This feeling must have gone to my wife's head a little because she started acting incredibly different. We met a nice couple at the start of the tour at a big breakfast. They sat at our table and stayed pretty close to us the rest of the trip. We took pictures of each other in front of scenic areas and started chatting about our lives back at home. This couple had a pretty lavish life. They and their parents owned hotels in New York City. I could see my wife's wheels turning as she started asking the couple for life advice. She started to seem disappointed and quiet because she was comparing our lives to theirs. We couldn't help that we didn't come from a wealthy lineage, but we each had decent jobs, and according to me, our life was good. We were making the best of our situation, but it wasn't good enough for my wife, at least not the vacation spellbound version of my wife, who felt like she could get used to this spoiled way of living. She started speaking with AP directly more, even if his wife and I were standing or sitting there. He made a reference to his extraordinary skills in the bedroom, and it didn't go unnoticed. His wife elbowed him, my wife giggled, and I wanted to take her far away from him. His wife had the same idea because she started talking with him and leading him away to look at the scenery. I asked my wife directly if she was flirting with him. She was surprised I asked so straightforwardly, and blushed as she said absolutely not. The next day, we went snorkeling, and I always seemed to notice AP swimming nearby. Afterwards, we were on the beach and thankfully weren't too close to the couple. My wife hesitantly asked if I ever considered a foursome. I spat out my drink. No, I didn't want to share her, and our vacation wasn't the appropriate time to discuss this kind of proposition. I had believed up until that point that my wife wouldn't want to sleep with anyone but me. I became very nervous, and after we ate dinner with everyone, we found out AP and his wife were staying on the same hotel floor as us. I didn't like this at all, and I would have felt even worse if I knew my wife already got AP's phone number. In the hotel room that night, she talked about the couple, but it seemed like she only talked about AP's wife, so I wouldn't suspect how interested she was in AP. I told her to stop talking about them, and that I didn't want to hang out with them anymore during our vacation. I added that I didn't like how AP stared at her in her bathing suit. She smiled a little when I said this, and I called her on it. She shut herself in the bathroom because she was frustrated I was being so accusatory. The next day, we went for an underwater walk wearing helmets with oxygen. We were able to peek into the lives of tropical fish. It was nice, and I didn't notice the couple as much. I was feeling happy and hopeful, and it seemed like my wife decided to wise up. We went up onto the beach to dry off, drink, eat, and tan. The couple was out of sight, and my wife and I laid side by side in lounge chairs. The next thing I knew, I was waking up from a nap. It must have been at least 30 minutes, because my legs were toasted by the sun. My wife was gone. I started walking around and looking for her, kind of disoriented. I saw some of our tour group members, so I knew I wasn't left behind. When I saw AP's wife was alone, I panicked. I noticed footprints in the sand, leading away from the crowd. In the giant rock face to the right, I found a sea cave entrance, and could hear my wife giggling. I only walked in a few steps to see them kissing deeply. AP's arms were wrapped around her, feeling whatever he could. I just yelled, "Hey," because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My wife gasped and pushed AP back. Then she began to realize how guilty they both looked, and that I definitely saw what they were doing. She said she was sorry, but it was without emotion. I was just staring at them for what felt like minutes before I just told them they were both married. I asked what the heck they were thinking, and my wife just quietly said she needed to have more thrills. My voice cracked when I asked how a trip to Bora Bora wasn't enough. How I wasn't enough. Suddenly, AP's wife appeared behind me. She freaked out even more than I was. In her dismay, she yelled about how he had the nerve to sneak off with another man's wife while she was carrying his child. Then it looked like my wife felt really bad. AP should have felt worse because he knew his wife was expecting, and he knew my wife was married too. I was sure they would have slept with each other if given the chance, so I left my wife there. I went straight home, leaving the tour early. I left my wife's belongings in the hotel room. I didn't care if she would follow me home or not. I knew I didn't want to forgive her for wanting and letting another man touch her, even if she regretted it or acknowledged that it was bad. Only a few days passed after I got home before I got a call from my wife's father. At first, I thought he was going to be upset with me for leaving his daughter there, but instead he apologized to me. My ex was there at his house with him, looking devastated and embarrassed. She told him she was in love with a married man that she just met on vacation with me. He told me she said I left her there because I was upset that she was spending time with this man. I corrected this, telling him that I caught her with AP's hands all over her and his tongue in her mouth. He was really surprised and uncomfortable. He yelled at her, calling her by her full name like she was a child. She acted like a child, whining in the background. He told me he was going to deal with her. 2 weeks later, he told me she left his house to live with her cousin as a sort of live inmate, in exchange for free meals and a place to stay. I didn't believe it because not even 3 weeks ago, our marriage was going so well. She was loving her job and we had hopes for the future. She just lost it when she saw people that had more. Let this be a lesson to everyone, not to get carried away just because you think you deserve what others have. Life simply can't be the same for everyone. Appreciate what you have, that you've found love and someone trusts you with their heart. OP, that vacation should have been a special time for her to appreciate the life you had together. It's supposed to serve as a way to celebrate, but she just gave you a reason to regret the entire marriage and all the years spent together. I am relieved that you woke up and found them. It must have been hard to get through this and fly home alone, but I respect you for that. You simply can't ignore when someone does this to you. They would never truly love you or put you above themselves. The relationship would become a form of emotional torture. It takes willpower and self-respect to leave a cheating spouse without hesitation. Just remember that this was not your fault and you'll only become stronger and wiser in the future by enduring it. Thank you for sharing your story with us. Let's now get into our second story for today. One day, I, 38, was at work when I got a phone call from my good friend. I hadn't heard from him for a while. He opened his own pizza shop after we graduated college. His pizza shop and all the people I knew and loved lived in Des Moines now. I was married to my wife, 36, for 5 years at this point. We started taking karate lessons a year prior because both of us were determined to stay active. Nowadays, it's easy to just stay home or work from home, so I gained some weight. I was actually in the best shape of my life when I got this phone call from my pizza shop friend, Mr. Pepper. He told me that his frequent customer, a family law attorney, just met for lunch with a potential client. The client was my wife. Mr. Pepper told me she told the lawyer that she regrettably started an affair, but she didn't want to lose alimony payments in case she didn't stay with her lover. She was completely absorbed in herself and aiming to use me as much as she could after she cheated on me. I could not believe what he was telling me. I was a UPS driver, so I knew a lot of names in the town. I asked if Mr. Pepper overheard my wife give the name of her AP, knowing it was a long shot. He answered me right away like he knew I was going to ask, and it turned out to be our karate instructor. My mind was blown. My heart was breaking. I thought it was going to shrivel up and die. When it didn't, I decided I wouldn't let her get away with this. I worked my shift for UPS the next day and actually had a package for AP's wife, delivering it to their home address. I can't remember if it was that same day or next that my wife and I had a karate class together. A part of me didn't know why I hadn't confronted her yet, but I figured she couldn't divorce me in a matter of weeks, so I wouldn't let her know I was looking for evidence against her. My wife's sister was there at our karate class and told me she was kidnapping my wife for the night to talk about her recent breakup. Her acting was pretty convincing, but my wife's wasn't. She acted all surprised and bummed, like she planned on spending the evening with me at home. I wanted to scream at her, but I refrained. I left in our car alone, but waited to see what happened. My wife's sister only stayed a few minutes before leaving alone. Then my wife came out with AP 10 minutes later and got into his car with him. They drove to his home address, and when I saw them getting out of the car, something overtook me. I drove my front tires up to the curb right in front of AP's house and driveway, so that my headlights and high beams illuminated everything. I filmed as I got out of the car, making sure I showed their faces as I screamed to ask what was going on. They were so shocked. My wife asked what I was doing there, but AP thought it was better to run inside with her and lock the front door. The house went dark. I considered staying and waiting for her to come out, but I had my proof and my blood was pumping. I drove home and printed out large, blown-up stills of their faces in front of his house. I put these pictures inside a taped box with Mrs. AP's name. She must have been away when I delivered her last delivery, because it was still on the porch in the video. So if she had more than one thing to open, I didn't think AP would even notice the package. With the box ready to go in my truck, my wife returned home, miserable and nervous. I said she had a lot of nerve to come back after what she did to me. She asked what I was talking about, as if she didn't already know, so I told her I knew she was cheating on me with AP, and that she met with a lawyer at the pizza shop. She was embarrassed and told me she was sorry. I told her she was a heartless cow for cheating on me, while I tried to do something fun with her, to learn self-defense together. I think she tried asking me for a second chance, but I could barely hear her because I was ranting about how unfair it was. I pointed out that she was only back home because AP was married and expecting his wife to return. My wife must have been an idiot, because she gasped like she didn't know he was married. So that was the fault in her plan. She wanted to leave me and start an immediate happily ever after with AP, but had no idea he was married. She told me she didn't see any pictures of his wife in the house, and I just laughed. I told her AP's wife would be seeing pictures of her for certain. She looked scared and worried, but mostly just discouraged and broken because she knew she messed up. She thought she was getting a new husband easy as pie, but now she was losing the only one she had. I told her this was all her fault for her delusional thinking and inability to see just how much I mattered to her and how much I didn't deserve this. At this point, I made it clear she wouldn't be staying in the house as long as I was here, because she was the one that ruined our marriage. She went to her sister's house. The next day, after I dropped off the package for AP's wife with the incriminating photos and note, my wife's sister came over and told me the truth about the night at the karate place. My wife had told her that I was emotionally abusive and would freak out if she wanted a night out without me. That's why she lied and didn't want to say anything to me. Now she knew the truth because my wife arrived at her house the night before, crying all over the place about what a terrible person she was. Sounds about right. AP's wife obviously freaked out when she got the photos and my anonymous note. She filed for divorce, and as a consequence, AP lost his karate dojo. OP, I am sorry your wife betrayed you like this. It is a wonderful goal to stay fit with your spouse. Fitness and good health can really improve your relationship while making the bedroom more fun and less strenuous. Learning karate is a wonderful idea for fun, culture, and a self-defense skill. Your attempt to do something good with your ex went unappreciated. Instead, she noticed someone else and made the decision to start a relationship with him behind your back. It is a relief that your friend at the pizza shop just happened to see your wife meeting with a lawyer and heard their conversation. He was good enough to call you, giving you the chance to act in your own defense. It's good that you got the proof you needed and brought AP's infidelity to light as well. Thank you for sharing this story. I wish you the best of luck in life. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, comment below with your thoughts on what happened. Something was strange. Dan looked at his neighbor's garage. The door was open and trash cans were spilling out onto the driveway. It wasn't like Kyle to leave doors open. Raccoons cause a lot of trouble in this neighborhood. He walked up to the house and noticed a newspaper on the lawn. That was a little unusual. Kyle ran every day and always stopped to pick up the newspaper. He also never left the front door open. Kyle was a theater technical designer and was constantly working with sound or lighting in his home studio. These projects often required silence or darkness, and for that reason, as well as the raccoons in the woods bordering their backyard, he had developed the habit of buttoning the house up tight unless he or Ginny went out into the yard. Dan knocked on the frame of the open door and called inside to see if anyone was home. Just as he was about to call to see if everyone was okay, he saw Kyle lying on the floor in the doorway of his studio. A small pool of blood had formed under Kyle's head. His face looked battered. His arm was bent backwards at a terrible angle and bruises were visible in all the places not covered by clothing. Kyle had been beaten in his own home and left without help. Dan quickly dialed 911 on his cell phone while he called out for Ginny. He managed to contain the adrenaline rushing through his veins long enough to give the 911 operator all the information he could, and then he rushed from room to room to make sure she wasn't lying in another room needing his help. She wasn't there. Dan had barely finished looking around the house when a police car pulled up with its lights on. An ambulance followed, and while the paramedics treated Kyle, the cops questioned Dan about what he had found. As Kyle was being taken to the emergency room, the only question on everyone's mind was, where is Ginny? Fade to black. Kyle and Ginny met in college. They were both in theater programs at drama schools in New York City, in the heart of one of the most active theater communities in the world. Ginny was studying to be an actress, learning how to create the illusion of a story on stage. She was great, but for some reason she had a hard time taking directions and preferred to give them. Her teachers noticed this and took notice of how creative her ideas could be. They began to prepare her for a career as a director or theater manager. Kyle was fascinated with the behind-the-scenes magic of theater. He didn't need to create illusions as an actor. He created different realities with sound, lights, effects, and his sets. He made it easy for the audience to believe in the actor's work. Kyle was immediately recognized as a genius. He was one of those rare talents who understands all aspects of technical theater, and he was as comfortable designing lighting as he was designing a sound story. They met when they were both hired to participate in a summer project in Connecticut the summer after their freshman year. Ginny had been invited there as a stage manager for her mentor and professor, who had just been hired as director for two of the companies for summer productions. Kyle had worked there the previous 2 summers as an electrician, and this year became assistant director of lighting and was given the opportunity to design one of the shows. Working closely together, the two immediately took a liking to each other. This will be the first of many productions together, both as students and as they build careers in the field. Ginny was slim and slender with a killer smile under her deep brown eyes. She was delightfully curvy in all the right places, but without a single speck of extra weight. Her long, tanned legs peeked out of the shorts she always wore, and her outerwear was conservative enough to say, "Please behave yourself," yet frank enough to say, "I may have a surprise for you." Kyle was very handsome. He was an avid runner and claimed that the best ideas came to him during his morning workout when his brain was clear of the mishmash of everyday distractions. He looked like he exercised regularly, but in reality, he didn't need to. The daily lifting and climbing he had to do was a perfect substitute for the strength training his friends advocated. He was fit and trim and was sure that if he continued to pursue his designs, even as a designer, he would remain so for life. For 2 weeks they shouted to each other from remote corners of the theater, focusing lights, pointing special effects speakers, and calling lines before they were finally able to sit with each other. They had to program the signals on the light board, and as they sat together, became increasingly friendly. When they were done, Ginny leaned over and kissed Kyle on the cheek, saying that she really enjoyed working with him and that she looked forward to her work every day because of him. Kyle kissed her back, just not on the cheek. She responded, and their little tête-à-tête in the control booth got pretty hot. The door to the theater downstairs opened and slammed shut as the director walked in and called them in. Kyle. Ginny. Are you guys done yet? We need to lock up. They quickly cleaned themselves up and descended from the stall. It's all set and you're going to love it, replied Ginny, coming down the stairs with Kyle well ahead of her, intent on hiding their little tête-à-tête. They started looking for opportunities to be together, but as filming began, time became precious. Ginny traveled with her professor every day from her apartment in town while Kyle stayed home, a short drive in the other direction. One night, Ginny's professor didn't make it to the show, but stayed in town to celebrate her daughter's birthday. Ginny was supposed to be in charge, but she had no place to stay. Kyle had offered a guest room in his house. No one else was there since his parents were spending the summer on the Cape, so there was plenty of room. Ginny was thrilled. She didn't think they would need much space. One bed would be enough. By the time they reached his house, it was late. Ginny had fallen asleep in the car, and he didn't want to distract her by taking advantage of the fact that she was so tired. After all, she had become special to him. He didn't have feelings for her like he did for those superficial girls he picked up at a college party or one of the many theater parties after a play. So when they arrived at his house, he was the perfect gentleman, the perfect host. He led her to her room, at least the one where she was supposed to sleep, and made sure she was settled in. Then he snuck into his own room to rest. He would still have time for a visit the next day. He vaguely felt the door to his room open and someone lying in bed with him. Soft, slender arms wrapped around him, and the sweetest kiss he'd ever experienced lingered on his lips. It was good. Kyle. Kyle. Get Dr. Kenton, he's waking up. Kyle. His vision flickered, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room appeared before him. It was hard to focus and he was completely confused. Only one eye was working. He tried to rise but was held up and immediately began to struggle against the restraints. Easy, easy, Kyle. You've been in rough shape, but we'll get through this. Don't fight us. We're on your side. He relaxed on the bed and looked at the post-op nurse who was talking to him. Dr. Kenton would be right there to explain everything. What's wrong with my eye? Kyle became alarmed when he realized his eye was heavily bandaged. He was badly hurt, but I must wait and let the doctor talk to you. Calm down, he'll be right with you. The doctor actually arrived very soon. He examined Kyle and talked about his injuries. Kyle was battered. His eye was bandaged as it had received at least one serious blow. The optical surgeon had repaired the detached retina, but the skull fractures around the eye socket also had to be repaired. He suffered a pretty severe concussion as a result of the blow that caused these injuries, and they were very relieved that he still had control of his speech. Kyle's arm was badly broken and was in a cast. He nearly died from a ruptured spleen and internal bleeding. If a neighbor had found him an hour later, he would not have survived. His nose and several ribs were broken. He had been unconscious for 2 days since he was found, and they were still trying to determine the time of the attack to figure out how long he had been lying unattended. I don't remember the attack. The doctor frowned and started asking Kyle questions. When he realized that Kyle couldn't remember any of the circumstances surrounding the weekend or the Friday before, he started asking general questions. As he finished, Dr. Kenton realized that Kyle couldn't remember anything that had happened since freshman year, before his encounter with Ginny. Kyle had suffered severe memory loss as a result of the attack, and only time would tell how soon she would return. Detective Porter, who had been assigned to investigate Kyle's case, was visibly disturbed. His chronology of the incidents leading up to the attack had hit a dead end last Friday, when Kyle had disabled the home security system. Where had Ginny been all this time? Shade of black. Senior year passed like a blur. Kyle saw Ginny regularly, and their love grew every day. By the end of the year, both had established careers, with Kyle working regularly as a designer for several small suburban houses and often backstage at theaters downtown for well-known designers. Ginny got a backstage job with a major opera company at Lincoln Center, a stable job with great benefits that she could keep for life. They rented a small apartment around the corner from her theater and enjoyed the bustling performing arts scene in the city. He remembered the tender moments they had spent together. She had decorated and shopped tastefully, and their apartment had been furnished so lavishly that it had become a popular hangout for their friends. He was a gourmet cook. Whether he cooked dinner for himself and company, or just a candlelit dinner for the two of them, she always rolled her eyes in delight at his delicious cooking. Her eyes were rolling in bed, too. Kyle woke up in a cold sweat, still lying in the hospital bed. Ginny. How Ginny fit into his life now. He had been told about the amnesia and how slowly it could come back. He had been told that these attacks would happen every once in a while, and he would almost relive his life as the oldest lost memories came back first. He wasn't prepared for how vivid the dreams would be and how much the thoughts of lovemaking would bother him. Previously, Kyle could only think of Ginny as a girl he knew from summer company, but now the memories of living with her came back to him. He really wanted to remember how she had fit into his life in the years that the concussion had taken from him. Where was Ginny now? Memories of their early life permeated his mind during the days that followed. Her advancement in her career eventually led to a position as stage manager at a very active suburban theater that put on plays and concerts. This company liked Kyle's work and often utilized his services. The couple succeeded financially and decided to get married. Now he could remember the wedding. The ceremony in the little church flashed before his eyes in minute detail. He could hear the small organ playing Bach, smell the distinct scent of beeswax candles burning at the altar, and his eyes watered at the sight of the smiling bride walking toward him. He could taste the delicious food in the little Greek restaurant where they had their wedding feast. They danced and then hugged family and friends as they traveled to the small inn where they were to spend their wedding night. Everything was beautiful. In the room, a fire burned in the brick hearth located right at the foot of their bed. They stood by the flickering flames and kissed. They swayed to music that wasn't there. With tenderness, he undid the buttons on her satin dress. As elegant as she looked in it, the glow of the fire further emphasized her nakedness. His body was beautiful, and she slowly approached Kyle, enclosing him in an embrace. He responded to her passionate kisses and pulled her down onto the bed. That night they made love slowly, each taking time to get to know every inch of the other's body. They kissed every inch of each other, and when they finished making love, they stared at each other's faces for hours, dreaming of a long life together and old age. In the morning, they woke up the same way they had fallen asleep, face to face, looking at each other. Kyle woke up again in his hospital bed in a cold sweat. He still couldn't stay awake for long, but he always woke up feeling upset when his dreams included sex with Ginny. Why did he always wake up this way? Was he still married to Ginny? If so, where was she? He asked the nurse to tell him what they knew about him. I can't do that, she replied. I don't know enough about you to fill in the blanks. I can help you remember, but if I suggest something wrong, it could lead to more serious problems. Unfortunately, Your concussion and eye condition require that you remain calm and quiet. Stress is undesirable right now, my friend. Dr. Kenton stopped by during his evening rounds. He was pleased to see that Kyle remembered events all the way back to his wedding, but there was still a 15-year gap between them. He agreed to give Kyle some information, but on the condition that Kyle would take it calmly. You're still married to Ginny, according to the neighbor who found you and saved your life. You still work as a freelance theater designer, and you're doing quite well. You have a beautiful home near this hospital. You and your wife have no children, but otherwise you are the stereotypical happy couple living the American dream. Now that Kyle looked more alert and sane, the doc spoke once again about the seriousness of Kyle's injuries. They were sure he would make a full recovery from everything. He went into detail about each injury, and Kyle heard nothing but blah, blah, blah. He didn't hear the answer to the question he wanted to ask, but could only think, where is Ginny? Ginny lay down on the dock by the lake. The water was cool on the fingers of her hand over the edge. Clouds hung overhead, slowly rolling over the hills that rose steeply on either side of the lake. She was in another world, far away from the city's rat race, from the constant demands of the snotty prima donna actors and musicians who came to perform on her stage. She was also far away from Kyle. She didn't know what to think of that realization. She was sure she still loved Kyle, but he was such a workaholic. He could never find time to relax, and his schedule was so tight that she just didn't feel that their time together was a priority. This little vacation with Steve was just what she needed. What could Kyle do to her? Divorce her? Fine. She looked over at Steve. He was standing on the beach, his back turned to her, kneading dumbbells in the sun, finishing his morning workout. Muscles bulged up and down his back, huge arms glistening with sweat. Steve had been a star college soccer player, and had played several seasons in the NFL before injuring his knee. Now Steve ran a local chain of fitness clubs and kept his body so trim. He was smart about money, and hired a manager who invested his NFL earnings in real estate. Who cared that he was dumb about everything but money? He couldn't sustain a conversation about anything but soccer and bodybuilding, but when he enclosed her in his arms, it was like something out of a dime novel. She fainted when he picked her up and carried her to the bed. Okay, Kyle, she pondered, get a divorce. We don't have kids, and look what I'll get. I'll be married to Mr. Universe. And I'll be Mrs. Universe. I'll trade the dusty theater for a gym where I can work out whenever I want, or spend all day admiring bodybuilders in lycra tights if I want. She couldn't wait for him to call. After Kyle had confronted them at the house when they'd left last Friday, she'd half expected to be wanted here by the bailiff with the divorce papers. She picked up her phone for the 100th time today to make sure it was working and ready for his call. The battery was charged. The signal was full, thanks to the convenient tower she'd spotted at the top of the hill. The ringer was on loud, but there were no calls from Kyle. They hadn't called her from work, as she'd arranged this week of vacation months ago. Kyle hadn't called in a week after begging her not to go with Steve. How could you beg someone for attention 1 minute and then not call for a whole week? And now it was Friday, and she hadn't heard from Kyle. She sat on the dock. Her naked body glistened from a week's worth of sunbathing all day and from visiting various wineries and taverns each evening. She loved the Finger Lakes. The evening sun illuminated everything around them so beautifully. Why did Kyle always insist on vacationing at the cottage on the Cape? No crowds, no small beaches, just the quiet solitude of the woods. Kyle again. She couldn't get rid of thoughts of him. Why hadn't he called? It was so strange. She sat down and dialed her home number. The message service answered. It wasn't pleasant to hear a recording of her own voice in response. She'd left a message in Kyle's box saying she'd be home early Sunday morning and they could talk then. When she hung up, she sat pensive, not letting go of the phone. Maybe there wouldn't be a divorce. Maybe Kyle would roll over on his back and beg her to come home. Yes, he will be on his best behavior from now on. Cooking clean and keeping her in a manner befitting a goddess. Oh yes, silly Kyle will fulfill her every whim while she runs around and enjoys the awesome body of her stud Steve. Kyle should be home. If he was angry, why hadn't he called? And if he wasn't angry, how did he feel? She knew he didn't have a show this weekend. He wasn't home. He hadn't called in a week or even sent a text. This was really weird. He was robbing her of the arguments she'd been mentally rehearsing since he'd left. She wanted this argument. She wanted to see his passion, and he didn't even satisfy her now. She called home again and this time entered the code for her personal message box, not the shared family box. It was full. The neighbors, Kyle's mom, and most disturbingly, Detective Porter were calling. Apparently, Kyle was hurt pretty badly. Apparently, his injury had gotten the attention of the police. Oh God! Thoughts rushed through her head. But finally, she remembered the last time she'd seen Kyle. Kyle knelt on the floor and begged her not to leave. He clung to her bag, assuring her that nothing could be so bad that she would leave like that without telling him. She had expected a more dignified response and thought this display unworthy of him. Honestly, I don't know how you can expect me to respect you as a man. Stand up and face facts. You don't treat me like I'm important, Steve does. You hoist light bulbs high up on the chimney and Steve lifts me into bed and arms so strong it takes my breath away. You complain that I don't make passionate love to you anymore anyway, so what are you missing? I need a week. I need a vacation, but not on the Cape. I need to find out how another man can make me feel what it's like to be adored. She looked at him disdainfully as he sat back down. Steve stood in the doorway and chuckled softly. That made her chuckle too. Be a man. Let me go. If he doesn't step up, I'll come back next week and we can talk. Kyle let go of the suitcase. If you leave, everything will change. We'll never go back to the way things were. Why do you think the place we were in was so special? She grabbed her bag and headed out the door. I'll be right there, Steve said. I just need to say something to that little wimp. As Jeannie walked to the car, Steve approached a sullen Kyle who was kneeling in the hallway. Steve's massive hand guided his fist into the back of Kyle's skull. The beating was short but inconclusive. Since Kyle's face crashed into the baseboard from the first blow, he was unconscious from the start. He didn't feel Steve punching him in the gut or striking him with his fists. He didn't feel his spleen tearing, his bones breaking. Steve wanted to leave Kyle with a memory of intense pain so he would wake up. He left without closing the door, got in his car with Jeannie and drove north to the lake. Jeannie smiled the whole way. She remembered how she had met Steve last winter. Kyle had always stayed so trim and slim thanks to running and a lot of exercise at work. However, she had gotten a little fat and, although not obese, looked much closer to 40 than her husband of the same age. She signed up at Steve's gym and contracted him as her trainer. She still remembered the first time he had fumbled with her in the hot tub when the two of them were there. She had been so enchanted by his caresses that she had let Steve take her upstairs to his flat. It was unlike anything she'd experienced with Kyle. Kyle had gone on a business trip to oversee the touring company for his last show in Chicago and had been gone for a week. He'd even called her and fondly told her how much he'd missed her that first night, that very moment. Kyle hung up the phone with a quiet, "I love you." Jeannie also said, "I love you," though addressing Steve instead of Kyle. That week had sex with Steve until Kyle came home on Sunday, too tired from traveling to make love. That was good. Jeannie woke up from her daytime reverie in alarm. She was concerned about Kyle's condition, for she really still loved him. She was also concerned about the ominous message left by Detective Porter asking her to contact him about Kyle's beating. He wasn't calling to inform her of the attack, but rather that she was already aware of it. She saw the bulky figure of Steve finishing his push-up workout on a low-hanging branch. Steve, what did you mean when you said it's settled, he's defeated? Steve looked up. What do you mean? Last Friday at my house, when we were leaving and you came out of the house following me, you said, it's settled, he's defeated. What did you mean by that? Oh, just marking my new territory. I had to let him know who's boss. There's only one in charge in any pack, kid, and I'm going to make sure I'm yours. Steve, what have you done? I punched him in the nose, got a little rough on him. No big deal. Steve, the police left a message on my answering machine. Kyle is badly hurt. Not me, baby, Steve lied. He was awake and moaning when I left. Maybe he got sick after he got drunk or a mugger beat him up after we left. We have to go back. No way, he replied. We have 2 more days to sunbathe and drink and 2 more nights to have sex. Steve, this is serious. Kyle is badly hurt and the police will get suspicious that I wasn't there and I didn't make contact. It won't be good if you hit him. He'll come in beaten up and we won't come back. You want to trade 2 nights of sex for 2 years in jail? She ran into the house and packed up both of them. When she came out, Steve was stowing his most important personal belongings, his dumbbells, in the trunk of the car. Okay, maybe you're right, he said. Let's go. They threw the bags in the trunk, locked the cab and sped south. Fading to black. On Friday morning the bandages were removed from Kyle's eyes. His body clock was finally free from the effects of the trauma and anesthesia from the surgeries. He was alert and flirting with the nurses. Repeated conversations with the police had so far yielded nothing, which was frustrating for Detective Porter. Kyle fondly remembered his pleasant home life with Ginny, his work on the show until about a year ago. He also remembered some big project involving his studio. Something to do with his recording equipment, something to do with sound effects. It kept him busy, but he couldn't figure out what it meant. He also remembered the intense pain. Somehow it was connected to the pain in his head, but he couldn't figure out how. He slept soundly on Friday night, knowing that he would be able to go home on Saturday. When Kyle was already asleep, Ginny came home to a dark house. Steve carried her bag into the house and they were both stunned to see a notice taped to the door, stating that this was a crime scene, but it had been processed and the occupants could return. Entering the house, Ginny froze at the sight of a large puddle of dried blood on the floor in the hallway where Kyle lay. She looked at Steve. Just a punch in the nose, huh? Steve blushed. He might have gone a little overboard in his anger, and if he left Kyle in critical condition without help, he might be charged with something more than a simple assault. His mind searched for an explanation. He wasn't in his right mind, and he wasn't exercising a precision machine. We can't tell the cops I hit him, Steve said. We have to tell them that I left first, taking your bag to the car, and that he was fine when you left. This is bad, Steve. This is really bad. Ginny, stick to the story and everything will be fine. We'll look like heels for leaving and not being around him, but they won't be able to pin anything on us. We? Ginny was incredulous. I was in the car. Anything they put on you is going to be on your sorry hide, not mine. Breaking up with Kyle, even divorcing him, is one thing. Going to jail for beating him up is another. You were with me, kid. And you heard me say he was defeated. You're in this with me. I may not be the smartest guy on the block, but I know what an accomplice is. She thought about it and realized that Steve was right. She wouldn't be able to explain their sudden departure unless they claimed they'd left Kyle in good shape, leaving the possibility that someone else had come along and beaten him up. How had she gotten into this mess in the first place? She agreed with Steve and they laid out their story. By the time they decided what to say, it was almost midnight. She called Detective Porter and he said he would meet them at the police station immediately. The case was urgent and couldn't wait until morning. Ginny wanted to go to the hospital first, but Detective Porter insisted. He told her that Kyle had been medically discharged and was most likely resting. He pointed out that she had taken her time to visit Kyle when he was in critical condition, and even today she had gone home instead of going straight to the hospital. There was no reason to disturb his peace so necessary to his recovery. But there were questions that needed to be answered. Ginny answered nothing until the detective suggested that the patrolman pick her up and drive her. He and Steve got into the car and drove to the station. They were questioned separately, but both had already rehearsed their story. They didn't tell much, relying on, "I don't know." They admitted that they had been in the house and had seen Kyle. They admitted that he was very upset when they left, but physically he was unharmed. Porter didn't believe them, but he had no evidence to back up his hunch. He knew that Kyle was being discharged from the hospital today, so he decided to keep both of them in the isolation room until Kyle got settled and until Porter could alert him that his wife was coming home. Besides, it might give Steve and Ginny a chance to believe that the other had blabbed and given away the truth, and maybe get them to talk more freely. Porter waited for Dan, Kyle's neighbor, to bring him home. Kyle cautiously made his way outside, still very sore from the savage attack. He waved for Porter to come into the house. Dan's wife Kim had come in earlier and cleaned up the hallway. The house was nice and inviting and smelled good. She smiled as she came out of the kitchen and invited everyone to the table for a home-cooked dinner. While Kyle appreciated Kim's efforts, especially cleaning up the reminders of the incident, he was uncomfortable being at home. He coldly recalled the events of the past week, up until the day of the incident, and the absence of those last fragments upset him. Kim and Dan cleaned up the kitchen and said goodbye. They agreed with the other neighbors that they would check on him every hour or two and make sure he was okay, at least for the weekend. They assured him that if he needed anything, he should call right away. As they were leaving, Detective Porter looked at Kyle and said, "She'll be home soon, you know that?" "I know. She's been here before." Kyle nodded at Ginny's bag by the door. "I know. I held them off today to make sure you're okay and ready to meet her. He'll probably be with her." "I'm ready." Detective Porter noted the determination in Kyle's voice and the resolve in his eyes. "I want to show you something." Kyle led Porter into his studio. Porter was impressed with the abundance of sound, digital imaging, and computer equipment in the room. Kyle led him over to a computer workstation connected to a large mixing console. "This is my main sound recording setup. I have a lot of interesting files here. Some of them I'd forgotten about until just a minute ago when I remembered. One memory has been plaguing me for the last day or two. Something had to do with a project I was working on but couldn't remember. When Dan and Kim left, it reminded me of another couple leaving the house. The one that left the house last Friday just before I was attacked. I may have been recording something when they came to call and didn't turn off the recorder. Perhaps there is an audio file here that will explain the situation to you if something happened to me. I may have recorded everything from the time Ginny and Steve left here until the recording reached the limit, which was set at 12 hours. I have to take this to our lab. I wish you wouldn't do that. I'd be happy if you'd let me fight my own battles." Detective Porter considered Kyle. He wasn't suspicious. He didn't need to be because he knew Kyle intended to repay the spanking and humiliation Steve had lavished on him the previous week. "Kyle, I love to watch a good bare-knuckle brawl, but unfortunately I will have to arrest both participants and witnesses. I also love to watch an outsider come back strong and take back what he lost. Steve is a big guy and he trains hard in this gym. It doesn't matter. Hey, what I don't know won't hurt me. Just give yourself time to heal longer." Kyle nodded. Detective Porter wished him the best and made sure Kyle put his phone number on the speed dial list of his cell phone. Fade to black. That evening, Steve brought Ginny home from the county jail. Her hair was disheveled and her clothes were disheveled. They both entered the house, but Steve waited by the door and she walked alone into the living room. "Hi," she said meekly. Kyle just stared at her with an absent expression. "I heard you were hurt, so I came home early." everything inside him was exploding. He wanted terribly to leap out of his chair and berate her for her feigned concern, for coming home 2 whole days early from a trip he shouldn't have taken to have an affair he didn't understand and couldn't approve of. But outwardly he showed only calmness. That's right. She was surprised at the lack of emotion on his part. After he'd begged her to stay, crying and covering her bag, she'd expected more. Are you okay now? I'll be healed. We have to talk. No, we don't. We talked last week. Kyle, we can't just let this fester in our minds. You need to discuss this with me. I need to know what to expect. Expect separation and then divorce. Expect you to walk away from me and never be accepted back. Expect me to treat you with the respect any other person deserves, but without the love and care I felt for you a week ago. It was partly as she had expected, but she hadn't expected him to be so calm and unflappable. So she would stay for a couple days and then move out once she got her affairs in order. She set her bag down and turned to sit down. I said you were leaving. She turned to look at him in bewilderment. I meant now. Go. I don't think you understand what's going on here. I may have hurt you. I may have ruined our marriage, but I have given no rights to my house or property. I will move into the guest room, but I will stay here until I pack up my things and move out of here. Before she could continue her tirade, Kyle flicked the remote in his hand. The stereo system he'd installed throughout the house switched on and played a recording of last Friday's events. It was clearly audible as she wryly belittled him, saying that she was going on holiday with a real man and that he couldn't stop her. It was heard Steve laughing as she told Kyle that she planned to have sex with Steve all week, if not longer, until she was satisfied. Kyle begged her to stay and sort things out, whimpering pitifully and trying to hold on to her bag. As she left, her heels clicked noisily on the floor, and Steve said, "Tough luck for the little wimp." After the door slammed shut, there was the sound of the door opening and Ginny called out in the distance. "Come on, Steve." He withdrew, and then could be heard saying to Kyle, "Just so you don't get any ideas of following us or trying to stop us." This was followed by the sound of Steve beating Kyle. Steve could be heard grunting as he delivered numerous blows to Kyle's ribs, and even worse was hearing him taunting Steve, telling him how he was going to beat the crap out of him tonight. As he walked away, Steve left a parting look. "Now your head is as broken as your feeble heart. Lie in your blood and think for an hour or two. You'll realize she needs a big dog to make her happy. But she'll come back to you when she realizes that a big male dog can't stay with one bitch for long." Kyle looked at an exhausted Ginny. Steve appeared in the doorway, looking at Kyle with a frown. "Why, you sneaky little coward." Kyle stopped him by waving a finger. "Porter doesn't have the tape. But he'll get it if I want him to. I don't want him to put you in jail. I want a second fight." Ginny was horrified. Steve grinned from ear to ear. "I'm proposing a bet. You both have to agree and your terms will be different or there will be no deal and Porter will get the sound file in 10 minutes via email. In 6 weeks, as soon as the cast comes off my arm and my ribs heal. You can't win." Steve shook his head. "No, I couldn't win after that cheap shot last week. This time we're going to fight fair and square. No sneaking up from behind and cold stabbing an unsuspecting victim. You coward. You'll see me coming and you won't be able to stop me the way I was able to stop you lying unconscious last week. Are you sure you can win on those terms? With your bare hands, man to man, no weapons? I'll tear you apart. Bet on your gym." Steve looked at him again. He wasn't willing to take a risk on this scale. He owned the gym and the building it was in. There were several offices in the building that were profitable tenants and it was an incredible cash cow. His apartment occupied the top floor of the building and was a luxurious space overlooking Long Island Sound. But Steve didn't believe this guy could be anything but a competitor to an athlete like him. Sure, David had defeated Goliath, but David had the slingshot. Bet all your gyms. Steve paused, reflecting on his burgeoning business. Not only did he have a flagship club, but he had 6 branches across the city and they were thriving to the point where he was thinking of selling the franchise. What? Put all that against your house and all that fancy electronic equipment? Are you out of your mind? No, my house and equipment are not for sale. You're putting this record and all copies on the line. You're staking jail time and the loss of all your assets later in civil court. You're putting your business, your real estate on the line. A silence hung in the room as Steve realized he was going to have to fight for his freedom. And your cars. Steve had several vintage and late model Corvettes, one from each decade starting in the 50s. They were his pride and joy, and the whole town knew it. The stakes were incredibly high, but Steve thought Kyle was nothing. Done. And the lake house? Okay, all the cards are in your hands, aren't they? I'll risk everything. But there's really no risk. I'll grind you down. Kyle looked at Ginny. She had listened to him rolling stakes for Steve, and now she was getting ready to hear her take her chances. If I win, I want everything and for you to leave. Not to contest the divorce, not to take anything from this house or our cottage, not a dime from our bank account or investments. You have to watch every minute of the fight. You also have to live with Steve until the fight, and if I win, for a whole year afterward. Ginny flinched but nodded in agreement. She knew Steve was strong. But she also knew what kind of shape Kyle was in, how much he ran. She'd seen him handling spools of cable and pipes backstage that usually required 2 people to move. Kyle? He looked at her with the same blank expression, and she felt bad again that she couldn't understand him. What if I'd rather bet on you? You already made that choice last week. This week your choice is freedom or prison. Fade to black. The weeks passed quickly, and Kyle spent them recovering his strength. He started doing lighting projects again. His absence from the scene had left a bit of a void, and his return was welcomed. At every turn he was asked about the attack, but he refused to give details. The circumstances surrounding his wife were the source of many rumors. It was widely known that she was now living with Steve. There were those who suspected the truth and waited to see what Kyle would do. He was known for his stubbornness, and none of these people believed that he would begrudgingly endure the beating and kidnapping of his wife. The stories of Jeannie abandoning Kyle in his hour of greatest need and the fact that he was so well loved made her a pariah in the theater community. It was the night of the fight. Kyle entered the gym in a t-shirt and sweatpants. Steve was already at the ring, wearing ridiculous-looking boxer shorts and a t-shirt with the gym's logo on it. Jeannie sat sullenly at the table, holding an envelope containing Steve's titles and contracts, his betting stakes. Steve was surrounded by many of his friends, as well as the staff and clients of the gym. They were all cheering him on, encouraging him, and teasing him about the easy job he had ahead of him. They clamored even more when Kyle entered the room. Kyle, with his light runner's body, looked unimportant compared to Steve's bulging, strong body. Kyle walked past Jeannie and placed his folio of contracts and records on the table next to Steve's desk. Climbing into the ring, he said, "Let's go. No calls, no referees, no stoppages until one of us is defeated." Steve smirked, snuck to the ropes, and held out his hand to Kyle. Kyle looked at it and, without taking it, delivered a punch to Steve's nose. Steve looked up, stunned, a trickle of blood flowing from his right nostril. "No bells," said Kyle, biting Steve again. Steve's imposing physique made him look impressive, but he wasn't as flexible as Kyle. His stiff frame slowed his reaction time, and he moved worse than Kyle. Steve ran after Kyle but couldn't get his big body to react fast enough to pin down the speedy Kyle. Every time he got close enough to land a punch, Kyle made him pay for it with a flurry of jabs to the face. Soon Steve's face was swollen and he slowed down his attempts to corner Kyle. Steve soon realized that his position was no better in the center of the ring. Kyle didn't look that big, but he was also a short man and had a significant advantage in punching distance. Plus, he kept up the pace while Steve was tiring from a lot of punches, the best of which barely reached their target. As Steve tired, Kyle began to throw punches to his body. It wasn't long before Steve's arms grew heavy and drooped. Kyle pulled him apart. "That's enough, Steve. You can barely stand. You can't defend yourself. You've lost." Steve stared at him, breathing hard. Both eyes were swollen shut, his nose was bleeding, and there was a nasty cut under the only eye that could still see. "Surrender now, and I'll leave you more than you deserve. Apologize to everyone. Give it up now, and I'll take this hall, this building, and the 58 convertible. You keep the rest. If you don't give up now, I'll knock you out and keep everything." Steve knew he was defeated. His head was already down as his body sank to its knees. "I apologize." Kyle walked over to the desk and pulled out the paperwork for the building, the gym, and the title to the 58 vet. Taking the keys in his hands, he looked around at the disbelieving gathering of Steve's friends and associates. "I'm closing the gym and opening a theater school here. I will honor the employment contracts you have with Steve, but will expect you to work for me in a useful capacity. If he transfers you to one of his other gyms, I will release you from your contractual obligations here. For those of you who rent the building, I will honor the terms of your contracts and negotiate fairly when they are up. However, there will be a different atmosphere here, as this space will be converted into a theater. If you choose to cancel your lease due to these changes, I will release you." Ginny stared at Kyle incredulously. They had long dreamed of creating a community of theater professionals and enthusiasts dedicated to the advancement of the theater arts. Not only was he realizing their dream without her, but he had the means to do so thanks to her betrayal. She felt completely abandoned. She suddenly felt very lonely and cold. The color disappeared from her face and she stared at a battered Steve. There wasn't a drop of pigment on his face, already blackened with bruises and reddened with blood from the cuts his friends had only bandaged. Steve had never looked so pathetic, so broken. Kyle had never looked so brave. There was no gloating or arrogance in him, just the cold confidence with which he did everything. Fade to black. 6 months later, Ginny was still living with Steve. After the fight, neither of them were interested in the other sexually. Nevertheless, they had to live together as part of their bet. It was a tepid coexistence, as each saw the other as the cause of the failures in their destiny. Ginny quickly and quietly moved out of her house, which was now completely Kyle's. The divorce had been finalized a long time ago. Kyle hadn't spoken to her since the fight and didn't answer the phone when she tried to call. Steve continued to build his business, but growth slowed when word spread about his failure in the ring. He saved what he had by offering season ticket packages aimed at seniors and moms who didn't work out outside the home. 2 of his satellite gyms closed and the rest lost their glamour. He'd lost his penthouse when his building was taken over by Kyle and had been forced to move into a small apartment next to one of the remaining gyms, which now served as his flagship. Now his swagger wasn't as cocky and often wasn't even present at all. Instead of the aura of confidence he had exuded before the whole Kyle episode, he seemed much less menacing. His mood was often sullen and he was constantly worried about finances, as he no longer received rent from his downtown building to support his other businesses. Kyle successfully converted the main gymnasium into a great theater space. He converted smaller areas into rehearsal spaces, stores, and dressing rooms. He carved out space for a small, intimate cabaret theater and opened a coffee shop with a small stage on the 2nd floor. The summer season was already planned and the town was buzzing with excitement about the opportunities Kyle offered for actors and audiences of all ages. As expected, Kyle had been so consumed with setting up store that it seemed as if he had forgotten about the entire attack that had taken place a partial year ago. But he still remembered everything clearly. He remembered every night when he walked through his own front door. He remembered every night when he fell asleep in his lonely room. He remembered every time he walked into the theater where he and Ginny were working on a project. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the memory that they had been together half their lives and still didn't know the woman he thought was the love of his life. One evening he was working on a light story in his studio when the doorbell rang. It was Ginny's brother Peter. Peter lived in Boston and rarely left the city. In all the time he and Kyle had been together, he had only visited Ginny twice. His presence meant something was wrong. "Hey Kyle, I'm sorry to bother you, but I really need to talk to you about my sister. Would you mind if I came in?" Sensing the urgency in Peter's words, Kyle stepped aside and escorted him into the living room. He offered him a cup of coffee or a beer, but Peter declined. "I'd really like to get to the reason I came to see you. I'm very sorry things have gone so badly between you two. I thought you two were a wonderful couple, and I want you to know that our entire family was shocked by my sister's sudden change of heart. She's determined to hold up her end of the bargain. She realizes she was stupid to give you up for an affair. But her life with Steve just isn't right. She chose Steve over me," Kyle muttered. "It just seemed appropriate that she get exactly what she wanted. She chose to have an affair. She made a mistake and betrayed you brutally, and no one blames you for how you reacted. She did a stupid thing, but life with Steve is torture, and now he's also given her physical strength. He hit her and broke her nose last night." Kyle hated to hear that Ginny was being abused. He wanted her to come to terms with Steve's stupidity, his early American style of dress, his life as a gym rat. He wanted her to be disgusted by Steve's sexist comments and expectations, his selfish attitude, his inexhaustible vanity. "Take me to her," he said to Peter. "She's in the car. She doesn't want to come in. She's too proud. She didn't want me to come in, and she's really mad. I just want you to release her from her promise to live with Steve for a year. She doesn't even want to do it, but I think he'll hurt her more next time." Kyle slowly stood up and headed for the door. Peter followed right behind him. "Please talk to her gently, Kyle. She's been through hell, and though she brought it on herself, she's suffered enough already." Kyle walked over to the car and opened the door. "Please come in," he said to Ginny. "We need to talk." Ginny reluctantly but slowly got out of the car. She walked into the house and Kyle whispered to Peter, "She'll be fine. Go to Steve's and get her things and bring them back here." Kyle led Ginny into the kitchen. A flood of memories came over her. Kyle hadn't changed a thing. Everything smelled the same, looked the same, felt like home. The only difference was that all of her pictures were gone. Kyle had replaced them with pictures of her family. Tears came to her eyes, for to be cut out of her home like that was just awful. She'd considered it her home since she hadn't had time to get a new one yet, and she'd considered life with Steve a temporary hell. She wasn't replaced, just cut out of this place she had once loved. Kyle was well aware that she was crying, and although he was touched by the woman who was still the greatest love of his life, he didn't go to Ginny. Instead, he poured her a cup of coffee and made her coffee the way she had always liked it. He made her coffee like no one else, not even Ginny herself. The smell of the steaming brew in the mug and the perfect blend brought her back to herself, reminding her once again how perfect her husband and the life she had left behind were. "You're moving away from Steve. Peter is picking up your stuff now. You're going to move in here. You can stay in the little apartment we built over the garage. You'll be independent. When you get well again and start working, you can move out whenever you want. If you want, I'll find you a job at my new store. If you decide not to move out, you can stay here as long as you want. I do not wish to witness any romantic relationships of any kind, although I intend to bring dates home if I wish. I expect you to take good care of your apartment, show care for my property, and respect our neighbors and guests. These are the only terms of living here. There will be no rent, no expectations or promises of any relationship other than a promise to observe decorum. Somewhere inside of me, I will always love you. Elsewhere, I'll always be afraid of what's in you that could have betrayed me the way you did. I didn't want Steve to bully you, so I don't expect you to finish your year with him. She swallowed back a tear and looked into Kyle's eyes for the first time in months and thanked him. She mumbled something about moving in with Peter, but Kyle reminded her that the New York theater scene was her life, and she couldn't exist without it for long. She realized that he was right and agreed to move in. Wait here. I'm going to help Peter. Make yourself at home. The significance of his last statement was music to her ears. Fading to black, Kyle pulled up behind Peter's car. He walked straight to Steve's house as if he were his master. Steve didn't like it, but there was nothing to object to. He had hit Jeannie, and now he found himself here with her brother and the guy who had publicly flogged him. Either of them could have sent him to jail for abuse, and Peter was using this moment as a slave driver. Steve carried Jeannie's things to the car. Peter helped him pack, but it was Steve who carried the stuff. There wasn't much stuff, as the terms of the divorce agreement left her with only a couple mementos and clothes. Steve returned to the house after the last trip. He began to talk. Don't say a word. Kyle was seething with rage. You know what's about to happen now, don't you? Steve didn't want to hear it. You broke her nose. You hit a little woman and ruined her face by breaking her nose. Stand up. Steve looked at him, but obediently stood up. Kyle stood up as well. He stepped up close to Steve, and before Steve or Peter could anticipate what would happen, Kyle broke Steve's nose with a swift right punch. Shade of black. 3 years later. Jeannie is still living in Kyle's apartment. She's not dating but is thinking about starting. She is one of Kyle's most valued colleagues, working as a manager, director, and teacher at his theater center. She considers Kyle her best friend and respected boss. She has written a play that has been successful in regional theaters and published by a major publisher. She is financially independent and is becoming like the old Jeannie. The fact that Kyle had welcomed Jeannie back into his life was taken as a signal by his neighbors, his family, and the theater community. She was accepted in those circles in almost the same status as she had been all those months ago, though no one had forgotten where she had been. Steve sold his business and, after some reflection, found that he didn't like what a jerk he had been. He eventually found a use for his college degree in physical education by taking a job at a local elementary school. He became passionate about working with children with physical disabilities and other special needs. He became a Special Olympics coach and volunteered in the physical therapy department at a local children's hospital. Kyle's theater project has flourished, and his programs have been accredited by the local university. His programs for high school students are highly regarded and have become very profitable. His professional productions pack full houses and attract the attention of New York's top critics, who usually don't stray far from Broadway theaters. Kyle and Jeannie lived close to each other, but they rarely spoke to each other. Although he took care of her when she needed help, he did so out of a sense of responsibility. She was the love of his life, and he couldn't see her in utter shambles, beaten down and rejected by the society that ran the profession she lived for. Having gotten her into a safe place, he wanted nothing more from her. He dealt with her professionally, after all. She was good at what she did and was a great asset to his company. However, he couldn't see her in any other light and rarely interacted with her even on a friend level. Jeannie accepted her position in Kyle's life as a blessing. She wasn't in jail, she was working, and she could at least make it up to Kyle in some small way. It seemed to her that living next to him with no chance of him ever loving her again was better than the alternative. It was impossible to truly make it up to him, but perhaps if she stayed here until she saw him happily settled with a new love and perhaps a family, she could find peace. It was inevitable. Kyle had fallen in love with a divorced woman he'd met on the Cape. She lived in a neighboring cottage with her brother's family and young daughter. She moved in with Kyle in the fall, and in October they were married in a beautiful but small ceremony in the backyard of Kyle's house. Jeannie declined the invitation to attend the ceremony, but watched the proceedings from her bedroom window, the only window that had a view. She cried bitter tears as she recalled the events that had brought her to this moment, and now the last chapter was complete. Tears fell on the last small suitcase, the rest she had already loaded into the rental car parked outside the garage. When everyone had gathered at Kyle's house for dinner, Jeannie picked up her bag and got into the car. Before she drove off, she took one last look at Kyle's house. She knew he would find the goodbye letter she had left on his desk as soon as she returned from her honeymoon. She checked her bag one more time to make sure she had her ticket, passport, and signed contract for her new job as a stage manager in London. Kyle had a new life now. She shed one last tear and set off to